Hello everyone. Today we've got a little bit of a different video lined up for you today. Mostly it's just gonna be me talking about the new mirror dungeon and my initial thoughts on it, basically. I don't really have a script set up for this, so my thoughts might be a little bit scattered, but hopefully I can piece it together in a somewhat comprehensive way. So I guess the biggest question to start off with is, do I think Mirror Dungeon 5 is better than Mirror Dungeon 4? And that's a bit of a complicated question to answer because in some ways yes, in others no. Okay, so it's actually mostly no. Pretty much all of the good things I can say about Mirror Dungeon 5 are basically just rehashing of old mechanics from Mirror Dungeon 4. And honestly, most of my major problems when it comes to Mirror Dungeon 5 have already been addressed and are, if not already fixed, are going to be fixed in a future update. So most notably the absolutely horrendous inflation that the Mirror Dungeon suffered for the first day or so. Like, things were just so expensive you couldn't buy anything, and getting something you wanted was just so bad. And honestly, that's a pretty great place to start talking about the Mirror Dungeon, is the actual currency you get during the entire Mirror Dungeon. Technically speaking, there are less floors overall in the Mirror Dungeon. You get maybe if you have proper pathing and take as little fights as possible, you can get maybe like 2 in a floor. And you know, with the absolutely terrible cost of all of the ego gifts and buffs and things from the shop at the initial inception, before they nerfed the cost of everything, or I should say buffed the cost, you just got so little cost to begin with that the prices, the really high prices, were just such a major problem. And you know, now they've kind of fixed it a little bit by giving you more starting cost, but the problem still persists a little bit. By nature of there being less floors overall, you get less cost, and as you get less cost, you can buy less stuff. And it's just a sort of perpetual loop, sort of. It's a little bit alleviated, like I said, with the price cuts, but the only way to really fix it is to just give more cost in the dungeon itself. Mostly it's fine though, so I don't really have that much of a problem with it. As long as you have the maximum starting cost, it's fine. But one of the biggest problems that sort of compounds onto this is the introduction of duplicate ego gifts, which are, in my opinion, completely unnecessary. I mean, we already had for fusion and cell only ego gifts before. They were literally every other ego gift that doesn't work in your specific archetype. For example, if you're using a burn team, pretty much everything that isn't a burn ego gift is for cell and fusion only. You're never going to use sinking ego gifts in a burn team, so why the hell are they introducing duplicate gifts? I mean, it just bloats an already useless pool of ego gifts. Like 90% of ego gifts you are completely unusable for whatever team you're using. So why they feel the need to introduce even more useless ego gifts, I don't know. It's just a redundant mechanic that isn't really necessary. I mean, if you want to make it harder to get ego gifts you want, you could just, I don't know, remove the guaranteed type from the reward pool. I mean, I don't recommend doing that, but it's better than adding duplicate ego gifts, that's for sure. And talking about ego gifts, the other major change when it comes to those is the changing of essentially the recipes for the fusion gifts, the fusion specific ego gifts. I mean, the intention behind it was to make it harder to get those powerful ego gifts, but honestly, it doesn't really serve that purpose very well. It only serves to really waste more of your resources to get it, and it doesn't really make it harder to get, you know? If you're looking for the burn ego gift, you're going to find it, like, before floor 4 anyways. So it feels a little bit redundant, but personally I don't really care that much. And yes, that is partially because of my solo bias, where the fusion ego gifts is completely useless, but even still, I don't think it's that big of a deal. It is a little bit, but not too much. However, the actual biggest change when it comes from Mirror Dungeon 4 to Mirror Dungeon 5 is honestly the one thing that broke a lot of fights. Not every fight, mostly just like, they said it in the patch notes, Quixote and Dongbeg, as well as both the Pink Shoes and the Automated Factory robots. All of those characters are completely broken by this change, and that is the nerf of every single enemy's health pool. They put like a flat 50% health reduction to every single enemy in the game, and that broke those fights because they have specific health conditionals at which they change their skill lineup, basically. You know, Quixote uses his one super unclashable heal skill when he's at like 70% health, and because he starts the fight with a 50% health reduction, he uses it instantly because he's below that threshold, and the same goes with the other fights too. And, you know, and despite the fact that this health nerf breaks multiple fights, it mostly only serves to make the Mirror Dungeon honestly incredibly easy. Like, so easy, you could probably beat a Mirror Dungeon run within like 20 minutes. No joke. And the reason why is because if you have just literally any 7 attack weight ego, you can just pop that every single turn at the start of a fight, and it just instantly kills everyone. Because their health is so low, it does like half their health instantly, and then you just finish them all off instantly. It takes it like 2 minutes per fight. It's insanely efficient, and it's entirely because of this health nerf. Is the health nerf a bad thing though? I don't know. I honestly don't know. It does help to speed up the Mirror Dungeon, but it also makes it insanely easy as long as you have one of these high attack weight egos. And even without the egos, it's still pretty easy because of it. Pretty much any skill 3 is capable of killing a single enemy no matter what, so. What other changes were there? Yeah, and I guess that brings me to my biggest major gripe with the brand new Mirror Dungeon, and that is the complete removal of the starter buffs and the replacement with the, let's call it the rest bonus buffs. The rest bonus existed before in Mirror Dungeon 4 as a way to get a little bit of extra starlight at the end of every run. And you know, back then it was perfectly fine because once you actually completed all of the starter buffs, starlight became essentially mostly useless, and as such the rest bonus wasn't as valuable. In fact, you could just mostly ignore it 100% of the time. And in fact, I did that most of the time and was sitting on a max 9,999 starlight stack for pretty much half the Mirror Dungeon's lifespan. But the problem with it now is that to actually get the maximum bonuses from the starter buffs, you need to have a maximum rest bonus. And they've sort of alleviated it a little bit by giving you a little bit of extra rest bonus to start with, but only enough to get like half of the bonuses, and that's it. Now the biggest problem with this, initially it was because, you know, it actively worked against new players who didn't have more than like a single team to actually use, as to actually get a full rest bonus you need like 5 different teams. And honestly, my biggest problem with that now is the fact that because it's essentially required to get all of the buffs, this means that there's now an arbitrary restriction placed onto the Mirror Dungeon where you're sort of forced into using teams that you don't want to use. For example, if you're a really big fan of Burn Team, for example, and you just want to play with Burn Team and only Burn Team, well, you get one use out of it with the maximum buffs, and if you ever want to use it again immediately after, because you only like using Burn, well, too bad. You have to start with only half of the rest bonus. And the only way to avoid this is to play a team you don't want to play. And you have to do this like 5 times to get the max bonus. So basically it's putting this stupid arbitrary restriction where you have to play with 5 different teams that you don't want to play with every time just to get the maximum bonuses from the team you actually want to use. And this is a big major problem when it comes to soloing specifically, because I personally only really like to play the game solo, at least the Mirror Dungeon anyway. And so I don't really like to do any regular team compositions. I just like to solo and only solo, but the problem is that 90% of all of the support passives used in a solo run are completely identical. Which means that if you want to do consecutive solo runs, you're giving up like half of your rest bonus every single time you do it. So it basically forces me into, like I said, playing 5 normal runs between every single solo run. And that's just an arbitrary restriction that makes the game frustrating for me because I don't want to do this, yet I have to get the max bonuses. And for solo runs, you really do need the max bonuses. I mean, you don't technically need them, they're not that impactful, but playing without them is just something only a fool would do, really, unless you're specifically trying to challenge yourself that way anyways. And so basically, what this has essentially forced me to do, because I don't want to do normal runs, is I have to just slot in random bullshit on my team to get the max starter buffs, and then just slowly replace everything over the course of the run. Honestly, the whole rest bonus thing is stupid to begin with. The only reason it was fine before is because it was tied to a thing that you could basically completely ignore. But now, because you can't ignore it, it's like, it's not a good mechanic, it really isn't. Honestly, they should just get rid of the rest bonus altogether. Like, just give you all the starter buffs to begin with, and then, you know, let you pick the different weird pack things. Like you do now, basically. And that's perfectly fine, it's just having to do multiple runs that you don't want to do. That's the biggest problem. That's the biggest problem with it. But yeah, so those are basically my general initial thoughts on the Mirror Dungeon. Essentially, for a brief recap, it's significantly easier than Mirror Dungeon 4 because of the general enemy health pool nerf, as well as being incredibly annoying thanks to the duplicate ego gifts, and incredibly frustrating because of the arbitrary restriction forcing you to play multiple teams that you don't want to. Anyway, the regular solo runs will return as soon as hard mode comes out, because I'm not doing it without hard mode. But I'll probably post some other solo videos in the meantime, probably a couple of duplicates from the previous one, or any other weird challenges I might think of, or maybe even some that you guys can think of too. I might do them if you come up with something interesting. I don't know. But yeah, that's basically all I wanted to talk about today. Like and subscribe and all that. Goodbye.
다음에 다른 기체에게도 다시 해봐줄래? 영상으로 남기면 다른 직원에게도 도움이 될지도 몰라.
역시 본인은 위대한 해결사가 될 자질이 있어.